this video I'm going to be building a Warhammer 40,000 Space Marine. I've recently got into Warhammer in a big way, and this sort of brings me full circle in a way, because it was originally Warhammer that got me into building models and sculpting in the first place. So I haven't really touched it in about 10 years, but recently I've got really back into it again, and I've wanted to do a larger scale sculpture of a Space Marine for a long time. I did actually try one a while back, and as you can see, although the basic forms are there, it does look a little bit rough. Now, a technique that I've been using for recent projects is to actually print out a template to allow me to build a structure that I could then sculpt over. And this is something I did particularly for my female android project. I created a plastic framework effectively that I could then sculpt over and then sand those pieces down to a smooth finish. Now, I did remark at the time when I was doing this project that it would have actually been really useful to have had a 3D printer to do this, so recently I picked up a 3D printer. Now, you may be wondering why I've bothered doing this, given that I do a lot of traditional sculpture and hard edge modelling anyway. Well, the thing is that there are certain shapes that it's just not that easy to create from scratch. I use clear plastic domes and egg shapes quite frequently to make shapes, but if you want to make something that isn't quite egg shaped or isn't quite spherical, it does suddenly become quite difficult. And particularly when I was doing my female android, I found that it was quite difficult to actually sculpt precise shapes. So while to the eye, the legs and the arms and things on this piece do look the same, when you start measuring them up and sort of checking for straight edges, you do find they're a little bit lopsided. So I think a 3D printer is going to allow me to be more precise. So I started this by modelling it in Blender. Now, I do need to say from the beginning that I'm not an expert in 3D modelling by any stretch, and this is really my first proper go at a 3D printed project. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about how I created this model, because there are loads and loads of really useful tutorials on Blender on YouTube, and in fact that's how I've learned myself. So if you're interested in learning this stuff, go and check out people like Blender Guru, because they really know their stuff, and this isn't a channel for that. However, in short, what I did was to import a picture of a Space Marine and then use it as a guide to start building some shapes up. Once I had a model that I thought looked pretty good, I then broke it up into its constituent parts and started printing them out. So my plan for the project is to 3D print the basic shapes of the Space Marine, but I then intend to cast them up and come in and then sculpt over them to create the intricate detail that you usually see on the armour. I can then make further moulds and eventually come up with a final figure. If you're familiar with 3D printing, then of course you'll know that the prints aren't completely smooth, so I know there'll be a fair degree of finishing that I need to do to these pieces. Of course, there are resin printers out there which have much better resolution, but I'm using a filament printer here, so I know I need to actually fill in some of the gaps in here and start cleaning up these prints. And as you can see here, this one's actually got a bit strange on the sides here. I'm not quite sure what's happened here, but what I'm going to start doing is to start sanding these pieces down and start filling in areas that I need to with car body filler. I can then sand them down, add layers of undercoat, and just keep going until I get a nice smooth finish that I'm happy with. So I've sanded my shape for my shoulder pad smooth. What I now need to do is add some edging strips to start adding some more detail to the print. So for that, I've cut out some styrene strips and I'm just gluing those on. I've also cut out a paper template for an additional part of the surround, and I'm considering using one of these clear plastic egg shapes for a power fist. So I've cut out a curved surround for the shoulder pad. What I also want to do now is just to add in some additional details here. So I'm adding some right angle pieces here just to add some additional detail. And what I've done is to push some monster clay into the gaps between the pieces of styrene plastic, just to make sure that there aren't any holes in the piece where silicone could creep in when I make a mould. Now, of course, I need 2 of these shoulder pads, so I'm going to make a mould of this. And once I've done that, I'm going to sculpt some additional sculptural detail onto the shoulder pad, and then make a further mould of that. So I'll end up with 2 moulds, one shoulder pad which is blank, and another which has some sculptural detail. And because I'm making so many moulds for this project, I figured it'd probably be worth recycling some old ones. So I'm just chopping up an old mould, and I'm just chucking that in to fill in some gaps in the mould so I don't use quite as much silicone as I normally would. Now, while you don't have to do this, because there are so many pieces in the mould there is a danger for air to get trapped. So what I'm going to do with this is actually put it back in the vacuum chamber and degas the rubber again, and that's going to pull out any air that's got trapped between the pieces of silicone that I've put in there, and also on the surface of the sculpture itself. As you can see, there's some quite large air bubbles coming out, so there's obviously a fair amount of air trapped in there. Right, so that's now cured, so I can now cut the size of the mould to free the piece. And luckily that seems to have made it through the moulding process unscathed, so I can now pour some resin into the mould to create an additional copy. Cool, so that's now cured and I have poured in some resin, so let's have a look at the cast that's come out. Okay, it's looking pretty good. There are some air bubbles on some of the details there, so I think I'll probably have to pressure cast this when I eventually come to do the final version, but that's looking pretty good. So I can now turn my attention to the original shoulder pad and start sculpting in some sculptural detail. So what I'm doing here is just drawing a centre line here so I can make sure I've got things aligned correctly, and then I'm putting some monster clay onto the piece and starting sculpting. And generally speaking, there tends to be some sort of winged creature on Space Marine armour I've found, so what I've gone for here is a skull with some wings, which I think looks pretty good. Now, one thing I'm going to be doing for this project is to be making lots of intermediate moulds. So while I've got some of the shapes that I need in 3D printed parts, for things like the thighs and the shin guards and things like that, of course I need two, one for each leg. And so I'm going to initially make a cast of this 3D printed piece. That will allow me to duplicate the pieces, which is what I need. But what I also want to be able to do is to cut in some panel lines and things like that. And I don't think I'm going to be able to do that particularly easily on a 3D print. So if I have a resin cast, that will have a nice consistency to it, which will allow me to cut in some panel detail a little bit easier. So now that my mould's dry, I'm going to cut the sides to allow me to release the piece inside, and I can then pour in some resin and create some additional copies of this piece. Right, so there we go, there's my cast. So I can now do a little bit of clean up on that and then start thinking about adding some detail. Now, for previous projects, what I've actually used is a blunted scalpel blade to cut in panel line detail into resin pieces. But having done a bit of investigation, I found you can actually buy ready-made tools for this. So I've got one here from Tamiya, which actually I think came all the way from Japan, so it took about a month to arrive. But this has got a nice hooked blade in it, which works really, really well on the resin. So I'm just using a ruler here to create a straight line down the piece to cut in some panel line detail. I've also cast up some pieces for the knee pads and for the thighs, so I can now use some aluminium wire to put these together. I just want to make sure that the form's looking right and I can get the spacing correct. Well, there we go, so that's not looking too bad. So what I can now do is start blue tacking all these pieces together so I can just experiment with the sort of pose that I want. Now, while I am going to make a helmet for the Space Marine, I do want him to be open-faced. What I'm thinking here is this isn't meant to be a model of one of the Space Marine miniatures itself. I want this to be a model of some of the Space Marine artwork that you can find out there, because some of that's really dramatic and really sort of epic looking. So I want to try and give this sculpture a similar look to some of the artwork, rather than it being just a scaled-up version of one of the miniatures. And again, this is sort of incorporating something that I've been trying to do for quite a few of my more recent projects. That's trying to include hard-edge modelling and sculpture together in one piece. So in this case, I've got all of the hard-edged modelling for the mechanical details of the figure, but I can then also incorporate sculpture onto the armour itself. There's obviously the armour for the Space Marines is often quite ornate. Now, one thing that I haven't printed at all is the power pack on the back, and I figured that this is something that I can actually scratch build. There aren't really any shapes in this that I couldn't create from scratch, so I'm actually going to build this out of styrene, plastic, MDF and some cast resin pieces. So first step in this is to draw out a template for the power pack. What I've done is to cut out a MDF shape, and I've also cut a piece of PVC pipe to size, which will serve as some circular detail at the top of the power pack. What I now need to do is cover the piece of MDF in styrene plastic to give it a nice smooth finish. So I've capped off the end of the PVC pipe with some additional pieces of styrene, and I've put a cavity on the back, which is where some mechanical detailing is going to go. So I can now start thinking about the air vents, and I've had these in the box for a while. They're resin casts of a metal sphere that I made some time ago, but I think they're the perfect size for this. So what I've done is to sand down the sides, and I'm also going to use an additional cast resin piece from a previous project to add some additional mechanical detail. And for the backpack, it's really just a case of adding detail. So I've bent some plastic here and drilled in some holes, and I'm just going to keep adding detail to this until I get somewhere that I'm happy with. Now that I've added some additional resin pieces onto the power pack, I now need to duplicate some of them because they appear more than once on the piece. So I'm going to make a mould of these two air vents and then cast up some additional copies. Right, so there we go, so I can then start blue tacking those onto the power pack. And it's always useful every so often just to put everything together again, just to make sure things are still looking pretty good. One thing I do find with the Space Marines is that everything's sort of deliberately oversized and crazy, so I think the power pack's pretty large there, and so are the shoulder pads. I don't really mind that so much. You tend to see that a lot of the Space Marine artwork that I've seen tends to have like a tiny human head amongst all of this massive crazy amount of armour, so I think this looks pretty in keeping with some of the artwork that I've seen out there. So I think I'm happy with that pose. So what I'm going to now start doing is to actually super glue this in place, and what I'm also going to do is put some epoxy on the joints and build those out. Once that's all dried, I can then put some monster clay over the back of that and sculpt in the detail for the back of the legs. Of course, I also need some feet, so what I'm also doing is taking some pieces of styrene plastic and one of the casts for the elbow pieces, and what I've done is to build up this master for a foot. So that's again some styrene plastic pieces, some car body filler and a piece of cast resin, and I've made a mould of that and made a duplicate, so I've now got some feet ready to go onto my sculpture as well. So now that I've got the legs locked in place, I can now come in and start sculpting up some additional detail. Space Marines often have robes and things like that flowing off their armour, so I thought this would be a cool thing to include. It will also make it a little bit easier to make a mould of this, because it will be one solid piece rather than sort of two separate legs. So there's a couple of benefits to doing this from an aesthetic point of view and also from a mould making point of view. What I also want to do is add some additional detail onto this, so I've got one of these ornate buttons that I've used for previous projects. I'm just going to push that into the monster clay and use that as a sort of a ornamental detail. Now for the helmet, I printed this out, and then it did sort of occur to me that maybe having something with so much detail on it wouldn't necessarily be ideal. Obviously I've got to sand this thing down to get rid of the print lines, so I did actually also print out a version which didn't have any of the details. It was just literally just a round shape with the indent for the face. But I did manage to sand down the original piece after a while, so I went with that in the end. And what I've done is to leave the interior face part bare. The reason being is I intend to sculpt some of this in, as it's going to be some some sort of curved surfaces, and of course I've scratch built the grille on the front as well. So for the eyes, I didn't necessarily want to sculpt those because they seem to have a nice gentle curve to them in a lot of the images and models that I've seen. So what I've done is to take this curved piece of resin, which is actually another cast of the knee pad, and after a lot of sanding and dremeling, I've managed to cut this down to a piece which actually slots in nicely. What I can now do is start sculpting in over that using some epoxy, and what I'm actually using on this occasion is something called Aves epoxy, which is something I've been intending to try for ages but never quite got round to it. It's very similar to milliput, but I think I do actually prefer it to milliput. It seems a little bit softer and easier to work somehow, so I'm using that to fill in a lot of these gaps. Once it's dry, I can then start filing it down and that sort of thing to get a nice smooth finish and tie all these pieces together. So this is as far as I've got so far, and I'm pretty happy with the way it's looking at the moment. Obviously there's still a fair amount of sculpture to do on this, and I've also got to make moulds of most of these bits. So a fair amount still to do, but nevertheless things are progressing pretty well. So I think I'm going to leave it here for this video, but thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook. Just search for The Dark Power.